You know, we often think about infrastructure as these big, tangible things. Roads connecting places, bridges spanning divides, fiber optic cables transmitting information at light speed. Solid, necessary stuff.
Right, the concrete and steel, the wires.
Exactly. But what if the most crucial infrastructure, the one that operates invisibly, silently shaping our perceptions, our aspirations, our very reality, isn't made of concrete or silicon, but of something far more ubiquitous?
Okay, where are you going with this?
What if it's made of words? What if the phrases you hear, the stories you tell, the language circulating in your community every single day is actually programming the potential of your life, your neighbors' lives, your collective future?
Programming. That's a strong word.
It is, and maybe especially potent in places often left off the traditional infrastructure maps, like, rural areas.
Yeah, well, that's a profoundly different way to frame something we take entirely for granted. We typically view language as a tool for describing the world as we find it. It reflects reality.
Sure, that's the common view.
But the perspective you're introducing, drawing from this source material we received, suggests language doesn't just reflect reality, it actively constructs it. It's the blueprint, the architecture of what can be conceived and built.
Exactly, and that's precisely the territory we're diving into today. We received some truly compelling source material, a collection of insights, a detailed methodology, a deep exploration into a system for rural education and community transformation.
And it's all centered on this idea.
It's centered on the almost revolutionary idea that language and its mindful connection to technology isn't a soft skill or an afterthought. It's the fundamental building block. It's about using words not just to communicate, but as active, powerful tools to build a different, more intentional reality.
Okay, so this material introduces us to a framework and a practice, right? The overarching system, the philosophy and ideology behind it is called ontosynclecticismo.
Ontosynclecticismo. Let's just take a second on that name because the source material emphasizes its specific meaning and how often it's misread. Ontosynclecticismo.
Yeah, it's quite a term. But it breaks down beautifully, doesn't it? It points directly to its core pillars.
It does. Tell us about that breakdown.
Well, the source describes it as an ideology, a philosophy, and a comprehensive system of thought. The first pillar is ontology, the study of being, of existence.
Oh, yeah, ontology.
This points to the idea that our language shapes our understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to exist in a particular place, what is fundamentally possible. How we name ourselves and our world shapes our very being within that world.
So the words we use don't just describe the who or what of our reality, they actively define it, like they set the parameters.
Precisely. It's about how language constitutes our sense of being. The second pillar is syncretism.
Syncretism, right.
This is crucial, especially in the context of rural transformation that the source focuses on. It's about integrating diverse ideas, knowledge systems, and cultural elements, not randomly, but into a coherent, locally relevant vision.
It's not just importing stuff from outside.
Exactly. It's not about imposing external models, but about weaving together global knowledge with local wisdom, traditions, and the specific context. It's synthesis rooted in place.
So it's a framework for exploring what it means to be and to exist through language, synthesized and integrated locally. Ontosynclecticismo provides the philosophical ground. Okay, now what about language consciente itself, conscious language? How is that defined?
Right, so conscious language, built upon this ontosynclecticismo framework, is defined not merely as speaking well or grammatically correctly. The source calls it an architecture.
An architecture.
Yes, an intentional design process aimed at constructing realities. Which kinds of realities? Well, realities aligned with purpose, with dignity, with cooperation, and with possibility. It's about deliberate word choice and narrative construction.
An architecture, like building design. But for thought and interaction. That's fascinating.
Yes, and this is where the source introduces that powerful analogy you mentioned, programming. Repeated phrases, common sayings, the dominant narratives we're immersed in, particularly in childhood, but really throughout life. These aren't just expressions. They function as programming commands.
Commands, okay.
That build the internal frameworks, the sort of operating system of our minds, and collectively the shared reality of a community. If that deeply embedded linguistic programming is full of limitations, fear, or resignation, well, it severely constrains what the system, the individual, or the community believes is possible or even worth attempting.
That programming analogy is incredibly potent. I can immediately see how that could happen in communities facing long-term challenges, You just hear the same things over and over.
You start to believe them implicitly. Now, the source material anticipates skepticism, which is good. It directly addresses a few key concerns right up front.
Let's tackle those head on because there are probably questions forming in your mind right now as you listen. First off, is this just a form of indoctrination? Is it about replacing old beliefs with new ones imposed from the outside?
And the source is very emphatic and clear. No, it is not indoctrination. The methodology does not impose specific ideologies, political viewpoints, religious beliefs, or dogmatic narratives. Its focus is entirely on training how to think, not what to think.
Okay, that's a critical distinction. How versus what?
Exactly. It provides cognitive and linguistic tools designed to expand mental frameworks, to open up possibilities, rather than to close them down or replace one rigid system with another. The core principle is based on diversity, equipping individuals and communities to analyze language, understand its power, and then build their own answers, their own futures, rooted in their unique context. It's about building intellectual and symbolic sovereignty.
Okay, so it's about empowering critical analysis and creative construction, not imposing a particular set of ideas. That makes sense. The second concern raised is whether this is just forced positivism, like just pretending everything is great when it's not, putting on a happy face over real problems.
Yeah, the sort of just think positive trap. Again, the source pushes back against this. It's absolutely not about blind optimism or denying harsh realities. Conscious language is designed to name conflicts, injustices, pain, and limitations with precision and honesty.
So it doesn't shy away from the negative.
Not at all, but it names them without embedding resignation. Using words like possibility, dignity, process, transformation, or reparation doesn't ignore suffering or hardship. It places those difficult realities within a narrative arc that includes agency and a pathway forward.
So it frames the problem differently.
Precisely. The source makes a powerful point. The opposite of conscious language isn't necessarily critical or realistic language. It's language that freezes things in place, that makes change seem impossible, that traps you in the current state. Conscious language is about active consciousness, engaging with reality to transform it, not just describing it passively.
So facing reality head on, but from a position of agency, not paralysis. That makes a lot of sense. And the third concern, doesn't all of this sound, well, too idealistic, like a nice theory that won't work in the messiness of real-world challenges?
And the voice acknowledges that, on the surface, it might seem idealistic. However, it firmly grounds the methodology in practice. It states that every concept, every tool, every proposed strategy is based on tested methods, successful pedagogical experiences in diverse rural areas, and replicable project models.
So it's come out of real work, not just theory.
Exactly. The idealism isn't presented as naive dreaming, but as strategic vision. It's the capacity to imagine a future state beyond current limitations, which is essential for designing effective actions in the present. It's a roadmap derived from observed successes and careful design, not just wishful thinking.
Tested, practical, and rooted in real experience, but with that strategic vision to aim for something better? Okay, that clarifies the foundation. Now that we've defined the core concepts, ontos eclecticismo as the framework, Lenguaje Consciente as the architectural practice, and address some key potential misconceptions, let's really unpack this idea of language as foundational infrastructure.
Absolutely. This is central. The source makes this central, almost radical claim. Language is not a mere consequence of development, something that improves after you build roads or create jobs.
Right, not an add-on.
Nor is it just an accessory, a nice-to-have for better communication. It is fundamentally the architecture and the very origin of development itself. It's the initial blueprint from which everything else flows.
So according to this perspective, before you even lay the first stone for a new building or connect the first fiber optic cable, you have to consider the linguistic soil you're working with, the words being used.
Exactly. And the reason this is often overlooked is its invisibility. Language as infrastructure is unlike roads or power lines. You can't see it, measure it with conventional tools, or allocate budget lines for it in the same way. It's the water we swim in symbolically.
We just don't notice it.
It's so common, so deeply embedded in daily interactions that we don't perceive its structural role.
Yeah.
We don't audit the language systems in our schools or communities. We don't ask, what kind of reality is this language building? And yet, the source contends this invisible infrastructure determines everything: the collective imagination, the perceived limitations, the goals communities believe they can pursue, the roles individuals see themselves in, the dreams they either nurture or abandon.
Its very invisibility is why intervention is needed.
That's what the source argues, yes. Its invisibility makes intentional intervention so urgently needed.
It's like a hidden operating system that dictates the limits of the hardware. And if that system is programmed with limitations,
Then the future it can build is severely restricted from the start. If the language circulating daily is steeped in narratives of scarcity, fear, mutual contempt, or passive resignation, the blueprint it generates is one of confinement.
that's a powerful image. Confinement by words.
The source gives a compelling practical example. A symbolic audit conducted in a rural school. For 1 week, researchers, teachers, and students meticulously documented the language used in classrooms, hallways, the playground, conversations with parents.
Just listening and writing it down.
Listening, documenting, and then classifying these phrases based on their impact. Were they limiting, motivating, violent, nurturing, resigned, hopeful? The results were eye-opening. Up to 70% of the phrases captured were classified as limiting or expressing resignation.
70%, wow. That means the dominant verbal environment, the constant background noise for these children and adults, is reinforcing the idea that things cannot change, that they are stuck.
Precisely. Imagine growing up in a space where the air you breathe is constantly whispering, "You can't. It's impossible. This is just how it is." This audit provides concrete evidence of the existing, often unconscious linguistic programming.
And you need that evidence first.
Having that evidence is the first step toward redesign. It allows you to ask, okay, what are the most prevalent limiting phrases here? What new phrases are needed to counterbalance them? What reality are we currently building with our words?
And how does this invisible language infrastructure, this programming, impact identity, especially for children in rural areas? That seems crucial.
The source delves deeply into this. The language a community uses to describe itself, its history, its relationship with the land, its prospects. This forms a critical part of the mirror in which a child sees themselves.
The stories they hear about who they are and where they're from.
Yes. If the narrative of rural identity is loaded with language of loss, abandonment, backwardness, or shame, phrases like, "This place has been forgotten," "The countryside is for those who couldn't make it elsewhere," or "Being a farmer is a dead end," well, it profoundly weakens the child's sense of self-worth and connection to their home.
It undermines their roots.
This is what the source calls internal exile. The child is physically present in their territory, but feels disconnected, ashamed, and convinced that their future lies only in leaving. Their mind is exiled from their reality by the negative language surrounding it.
Internal exile. That's a deeply sad and powerful image. It speaks to a kind of internal uprooting caused by external narratives. So how does this methodology propose breaking that cycle of resignation and combating this symbolic abandonment?
The source outlines a clear 3-action process aimed at transforming this linguistic environment. It's particularly crucial during the formative years, but really applicable to all. First is detect.
Detect, like the audit.
Yes, it builds on the audit concept. It involves training teachers, parents, community leaders, key figures in the child's life to become acute listeners, to consciously identify the unconscious limiting linguistic structures that circulate daily.
Not just hear them, but identify them.
Right. Not to shame or correct immediately, but to detect, to listen attentively, make lists, and analyze them collectively. What are the phrases that kill possibility? What are the words that reinforce helplessness? Make the invisible visible.
Okay, detect. Then what?
Second is substitute. It's not sufficient to simply identify and try to suppress the negative language. The void must be filled with something else. This step involves actively creating, designing, and introducing new, regenerative language.
So building the positive alternatives.
Exactly. Replace phrases like, "This is not for us," with, "We can create this together here." Shift from, "If you don't study, you'll end up a campesino," a phrase that equates rural life with failure, to something like, "Being a campesino and knowing how to program sensors is future leadership." The emphasis is on generating and circulating life-affirming, possibility-opening language.
Creating, not just eliminating. Got it. And the third step.
Practice. The new language cannot remain just words on a list or concepts discussed in a workshop. It must become a living, breathing part of the daily environment.
Make it real.
Yes. This means intentionally creating a regenerative verbal ecology in schools, homes, and the community. How? Through games designed to practice new phrases, through songs that embed regenerative ideas, through simulations and role-playing, through technology projects like robotics where students have to narrate their design process and purpose, through debates using conscious language principles. Make the new language a natural, effortless way of being and interacting.
So first, become acutely aware of the existing negative programming, then intentionally design positive, regenerative, alternative language, and finally, embed that new language through constant lived practice across different contexts. That makes the process feel more tangible. Can you give us a few more examples from the source of those common limiting phrases that act as programming commands and how they are transformed?
Sure, the source provides vivid examples from his fieldwork. These phrases are like invisible chains, really. Toca aguantar, meaning roughly you just have to bear it, or that's just how it is, endure it. Very passive.
Yeah, resignation right there.
Or aquí nadie sale adelante.
Yeah,
Nobody ever gets ahead here.
total closure.
Eso es para los de ciudad. That's for city people, not us. Creating an us versus them in a sense of lack.
Setting limits based on place.
Nos tocó así. This is just our lot. This is what we ended up with. Again, fatalistic.
Accepting without question.
And a really common one. Uno nace pobre y se muere pobre. You're born poor and you die poor.
Wow. Those are heavy phrases. They really do sound like commands to limit one's aspirations, like you said.
They function precisely that way. The source calls them linguistic devices of closure. They shut down imagination, curtail vision, erode self-esteem, and kill initiative. They present themselves as immutable facts about reality, trapping people in a state of helplessness.
Especially damaging for kids hearing that constantly.
Absolutely. When a child hears these constantly, they internalize them as universal truths about their own potential and their home's potential. The proposed transformation isn't to deny the poverty or the difficulty, but to change the semantic frame from resignation to agency and possibility.
Okay, show me the after versions.
So instead of toca aguantar, shift to podemos transformar or we can transform.
Active.
From aquí nadie sale adelante, move to podemos construir juntos nuestro futuro. We can build our future together here.
Collective action.
Replace eso es para los de ciudad with podemos crear eso y más aquí. We can create that and more here.
Asserting capability.
Nos tocó así. Becomes podemos hacer algo distinto. We can do something different.
Opening possibilities.
And the resonant uno nace pobre y se muere pobre is reframed as nacemos con poco, pero podemos crear mucho. We are born with little, but we can create much.
That difference in energy and possibility just in those phrasing shifts is remarkable. It's not denying the starting point, but it completely changes the potential trajectory.
It changes the internal map, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And the source underscores that changing the phrase is necessary, but not sufficient. If the underlying belief system, the emotional resonance associated with the old phrases, doesn't change, the new words will just sound hollow.
Like just pasting positive words over a negative feeling?
Exactly. This is why the practice step is crucial, and why the methodology emphasizes reentrenamiento lingüístico, linguistic retraining, that involves cognitive and emotional development, not just rote memorization of new phrases. Pedagogy needs to provide narratives, experiences, and living examples that validate the new language.
So you have to show it's possible, not just say it.
Yes. It's about showing how it is possible, providing tangible proof points, building new emotional memories associated with the regenerative language. And it must be a compassionate process, recognizing that old phrases were often coping mechanisms or expressions of deep-seated pain or historical reality.
Yeah.
You can't just dismiss them angrily.
That approach, integrating compassion and practical proof, sounds much more likely to stick than just correcting someone's vocabulary. So how does the methodology actually guide this profound transformation process? What are the steps involved beyond detect, substitute, practice?
Well, as mentioned earlier, the foundational first step is always the symbolic diagnosis, deep, active listening to the community's language. Not just what is said, but how, with what tone, and crucially, what is left unsaid.
The silences can be as telling as the words.
Exactly. How are the future, the land, work, relationships, challenges, successes named? What words are missing from the collective conversation? This diagnosis is the map from which specific linguistic interventions are designed.
It's like a linguistic fingerprint of the community's current reality and potential blockages.
Precisely. And the methodology is presented as a structured, systematic approach, like a detailed route map. It's not a collection of isolated tips. Its components are interdependent and build upon each other, guiding the process from awareness to action.
Okay, a system. How does it build the critical thinking needed to avoid that indoctrination concern you mentioned earlier? Because that seems like a real tightrope walk.
It is, and critical thinking is woven throughout. The methodology provides explicit tools for detecting semantic manipulation, how language is used to persuade, mislead, or control. often subtly.
Like recognizing propaganda or spin.
Yes, or identifying polarizing narratives, how language is used to create division and enmity. And it teaches how to reinterpret stigmatized words, reclaiming their meaning or exposing the agenda behind their negative framing.
Taking back the power of certain words.
The core aim is to cultivate the individual and collective capacity to question language, to analyze its underlying assumptions and intentions, to challenge dominant narratives, and to actively resignify words and concepts. It's about developing discernment, not compliance.
So, it's about giving people the tools to analyze any language, not just telling them which language to use or avoid. What are some practical tools it offers for this linguistic analysis and transformation?
A very practical method taught, especially in educational settings, is the EEC method. Escuchar, listen, intender, understand, and construer, construct.
EEC, listen, understand, construct.
Okay, escuchar. Pay careful attention to the specific words used, the tone, and the nonverbal cues, what is actually being said, just the facts. Intender, this goes deeper. Try to understand the emotions, the underlying beliefs, the intentions, the unexpressed needs behind the words. What is this person or this phrase trying to convey, or what is its historical weight? Why is it being said this way? Construer, based on that understanding, consciously construct an alternative way of expressing the core message or addressing the situation using conscious, regenerative language.
Can you walk through an example of the EEC method? Make it concrete.
Okay. A common phrase encountered might be, eso no se puede hacer aquí. That cannot be done here. Listen, the phrase states a limitation specific to the local context. Straightforward. Understand. Behind that phrase, there might be a history of failed attempts, a real lack of resources, a fear of trying something new and looking foolish, a belief that we lack the necessary skills compared to others elsewhere. The underlying intention might be to express frustration, caution, or a sense of powerlessness. It's not just about the literal meaning, construct. Instead of accepting the limitation as a final statement, the methodology proposes reframing it into a question that opens possibility. For example, ¿qué necesitaríamos? Recursos, conocimientos, alianzas para poder intentar hacerlo aquí. What would we need? Resources, knowledge, alliances to be able to try to do that here.
That's a fundamental shift. It moves from a declarative statement of impossibility to an inquiry about the conditions for possibility. It changes the whole mental landscape around the challenge. That's really powerful.
It does. It shifts the energy from closed-off resignation to active problem-solving. Another engaging tool described is the game Traductores de lo no dicho, translators of the unsaid.
Translators of the unsaid. Intriguing name.
This is often used with students. They take common, limiting, or harmful phrases they hear, and maybe in groups, translate them into conscious language. It's an active, creative process of rewriting the implicit narratives and practicing alternative ways of speaking and thinking about their reality.
That turns a critical skill into a playful activity. Very clever. Who is this methodology designed for? Is it solely focused on transforming the language of children? Because we've talked a lot about schools.
While the source material puts a strong focus on childhood and adolescence as crucial formative periods, naturally it emphasizes that conscious language is a transversal tool for the entire community ecosystem.
Transversal meaning.
Meaning it cuts across all sectors and age groups. It's designed to be applied by and benefit teachers, community leaders, parents, local officials, entrepreneurs, young people, older adults, everyone. The symbolic transformation of a territory isn't just about changing the language of the next generation. It requires an intergenerational dialogue and practice.
It has to be everybody, otherwise the old patterns persist.
Exactly. When all key actors become conscious of their own linguistic patterns and actively engage in building a shared regenerative language, the systemic change happens much faster and deeper. It's an intergenerational pedagogy because language flows between generations.
That makes sense. Language is shared. How does this methodology integrate into the existing school curriculum? Does it become a new subject, like Conscious Language 101?
No, the source is clear it's not a standalone subject. It functions as a transversal methodology, a core symbolic logic that permeates and enhances all existing subjects.
Okay, permeates. How?
It's integrated into language arts, obviously, but also into math, science, social studies, technology, art, ethics, and even physical education.
How does that work in practice? Give me an example beyond just obvious language classes. How does conscious language fit into, say, math?
Think about it. In a math class, it's about fostering semantic precision in formulating problems and explanations, ensuring clarity of thought expressed through numbers and words, using language that empowers problem solving, let's figure out how, versus language that implies inability. It's too hard.
Okay, precision and framing, science.
In science, it's about asking precise questions, describing observations objectively yet meaningfully, and debating hypotheses respectfully using evidence-based language, avoiding language that shuts down inquiry.
And technology.
In technology class, it's about not just teaching coding or electronics, but teaching students to articulate the purpose and humanity behind their technological creations, designing interfaces and systems that communicate with dignity and clarity.
Social.
Analyzing historical narratives for implicit biases. Understanding how language shapes historical accounts, and using language to understand complex social issues without resorting to polarization or harmful stereotypes. Every subject becomes a space where the teacher models and students practice conscious language use, linking the specific subject matter to the broader goal of building a more conscious reality.
So it becomes the underlying philosophy of how all subjects are taught and learned, using language as the key. Let's circle back to one of the major challenges you mentioned, polarization. That feels incredibly relevant today. How does conscious language tackle this semantic kidnapping, where words become tools of division?
Yeah, this is a significant focus in the source material because polarization is a major barrier to collective action, particularly noted in many rural areas it discusses. Semantic kidnapping is when words are ripped from their nuanced meanings and turned into charged labels used to divide and categorize people into us versus them.
Weaponized words.
Exactly. Words like empresa, company, gobierno, government, izquierda, left, derecha, right, progreso, tradition. They cease to be terms for discussion and become identity markers in a linguistic trench war.
Communication breaks down completely.
Language stops being a bridge for understanding difference and becomes a wall to reinforce antagonism. This impoverishes the collective capacity for complex thought and shared problem-solving because the necessary common vocabulary is destroyed or, well, kidnapped.
It's like the words themselves are held hostage, preventing dialogue.
Perfectly put. And the methodology aims to liberate these palabras raptadas, raped or kidnapped words, a strong term used in the source. The goal isn't to erase difference, but to recover the precision and practical meaning of these terms, focusing the conversation on underlying principles and shared goals.
How do you do that?
For example, instead of getting stuck on izquierda or derecha, discuss principles like cooperation productiva. How can we collaborate effectively to create value? Or justicia intergenerational. How do our actions today impact future generations? It shifts the focus from ideological labels to concrete principles that can be applied locally and discussed more rationally.
So bringing back nuance and focusing on shared principles rather than divisive labels, what specific techniques does the methodology teach for depolarizing communication? Because that sounds hard.
It is hard. A fundamental technique taught is escuchar sin reactor, listening without automatically reacting or judging. This involves consciously pausing after hearing something potentially triggering, taking a breath, and making a choice about how to respond rather than immediately firing back from a place of defense or anger.
The pause is key.
It's crucial. It involves asking clarifying questions. When you say X, could you tell me more about what you mean by that? Seeking to genuinely understand the other's perspective and practicing expressing one's own thoughts and feelings using I statements. From my perspective, I see it this way. I feel concerned when. Rather than accusatory you statements. You always say that you're wrong because.
Those I statements make a huge difference.
They do. And teaching this from childhood is seen as foundational for building critical thinking, empathy, and the capacity for constructive disagreement necessary for any functioning democracy, really.
That requires incredible discipline, especially in heated discussions. Does technology play a role in this fight against semantic kidnapping and polarization?
Yes, the source integrates technology here in innovative ways. It mentions tools like Mandrake simulators, envisioned potentially as video games or interactive environments where participants can practice identifying and deactivating prejudiced language, rescuing kidnapped words by using them in neutral or constructive contexts, and building linguistic bridges to simulate solving community conflicts.
So like a flight simulator for difficult conversations.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah.
These simulations allow for safe practice of difficult conversations without real-world consequences if you mess up. The use of Hyperbox and Arduino is also reframed not just as tech tools given to marginalized rural areas, but as nodes of community innovation, changing the narrative about technology access from one of aid to one of empowerment and local creation.
Using technology to create a safe space for practicing difficult, depolarized conversations, that's a creative application. The source also mentions creating a glossario de dignidad and laboratorio de frases regenerativas. Tell us more about those practical exercises.
Okay, a glossario de dignidad. Dignity Glossary, is a collective, community-based exercise. People come together to identify terms commonly used to describe their community or themselves in deficit terms, like pobreza extrema, extreme poverty, zona roja, red zone, dangerous area, marginal, etc.
Labels that define them negatively.
Exactly. And they collaboratively create alternative language that acknowledges the reality but emphasizes dignity, resilience, and potential. It's about reclaiming the narrative from external or internal deficit perspectives. It's a very empowering process.
Taking control of how they're named.
Yeah.
And the laboratory.
The laboratorio de phrases regenerativas, a regenerative phrase laboratory, is often done in schools or workshops. Participants take a common local story, challenge, or scene and first describe it using the prevalent limiting language they identified earlier.
The before picture?
Right. Then they collectively rewrite it using conscious language, analyzing how the emotional tone, the perceived possibilities, and the collective image of the community or situation change simply by changing the words used. It's a hands-on experience of language's transformative power. You see the shift happen right there.
Those sound like powerful ways to make the abstract concept of conscious language concrete and collaborative. It seems the overall strategy isn't to pretend challenges don't exist, but to name them in a way that unlocks potential.
Precisely. That's a perfect summary. It's about shifting from problem naming that paralyzes to problem naming that mobilizes. Instead of saying, we lack internet connectivity, the conscious language reframes it as, we lack internet connectivity, which means we have an opportunity to explore offline technological solutions for our needs.
Finding the opening within the constraint.
Exactly. Or instead of our economy is based only on agriculture, it becomes our economy is based on agriculture. So we can develop sensors and precision technology to make our crops more efficient and sustainable. You name the challenge accurately, but you immediately embed the possibility for response and innovation within the phrasing itself.
That reframing feels incredibly empowering. It changes the energy completely. Now let's talk about who makes this happen, particularly in the educational system. The source redefines the role of the teacher, calling them an engineer of emotional language. What does that mean? That's quite a title.
It is, isn't it? It elevates the teacher's role beyond being simply a transmitter of content. The source sees the teacher as a crucial designer of symbolic experiences, someone who actively builds linguistic bridges in the minds of students, connections between thought, emotion, their community, and their future potential.
Linguistic bridges. I like that.
It's described as an ethical role, responsible use of language, an aesthetic role, crafting language beautifully and effectively, and a regenerative role, using language to foster growth and possibility. The teacher's words, tone, and the linguistic environment they create in the classroom are seen as fundamental to student development, not just incidental.
That's a much richer definition than just teacher. What specific functions does this engineer of emotional language perform, according to the source?
The source outlines 3 key functions. 1. Curador de palabras, word curator. The teacher carefully selects and calibrates the language used in the classroom and in materials. This includes their own language and the language they expose students to through texts or examples.
Choosing words deliberately.
Yes. It means choosing words that are precise, inclusive, and constructive, and consciously naming things in a way that builds dignity. For example, how they correct a student's mistake. Instead of just saying, that's wrong, a word curator might say, that shows original thinking, let's add some precision here, or good attempt, now let's refine the concept using these specific terms. It focuses on the process and path forward.
Okay, word curator. What else?
2. Modelador de tono, tone modeler. Tone carries the emotional weight of language, as we know. The teacher models a conscious tone that is clear, firm when necessary, but also warm, respectful, and encourages curiosity. They create an emotional climate in the classroom where making mistakes is seen as a learning opportunity, not a catastrophe.
Setting the emotional temperature.
Right, where different opinions can be expressed safely and where dignity is the baseline. And 3, codiseñador del clima emocional, emotional climate co-designer. Building on the tone, the teacher actively co-designs the overall emotional environment of the classroom and school through establishing clear norms for interaction.
Norms around language.
Exactly. Are listening and respectful dialogue prioritized? Is ridicule tolerated, even subtly? The norms around language used directly shape whether the environment fosters trust, openness, and a sense of belonging, which are essential for conscious language to flourish. Tolerating contempt through language legitimizes it. Establishing norms of active, non-reactive listening builds a climate of dignity.
So it's not just the content, but the vocabulary, the delivery, and the environment created through language. The source also mentions rituales lingüísticos, linguistic rituals.
Yes, these are planned verbal routines used in the classroom or community. Things like specific greetings at the start of the day that reinforce positive values, collective phrases said together before starting a task, or structured word circles where everyone gets a chance to speak and listen consciously, maybe using a talking stick or similar protocol.
Giving structure to conscious speaking and listening.
Right. These rituals are designed to anchor students emotionally, build a sense of collective identity and belonging, and reinforce positive linguistic habits. The words chosen for these rituals are intentional, designed to elevate the participants and their shared purpose.
That adds a layer of cultural practice to the methodology. And what about using language for emotional regeneration, particularly when giving feedback? That's often a tricky area.
Very tricky. Two key techniques are highlighted. El elogio específico, specific praise, moves beyond generic good job to acknowledge the specific effort, process, or quality of the work. Instead of your drawing is nice, it's I see how you use those colors to create depth there. Or I appreciate the way you structured your argument in paragraph 3.
Focusing on the specifics.
Yes. This teaches students to recognize their own specific skills and encourages them by validating their actions, not just the final outcome. And the second one is la retroalimentación regenerativa, regenerative feedback.
Regenerative feedback, how does that work?
It provides a structure for constructive criticism that supports growth, rather than shutting the person down. It generally follows 3 steps. 1, recognize something that was achieved or done well, find the positive. 2, signal clearly and specifically what is missing or needs improvement. Be direct, but constructive. 3, suggest a concrete, actionable path forward for how to improve. Offer guidance.
Recognize, signal, suggest. That's a framework that could benefit anyone, anywhere, not just in schools. That's very practical.
It is. This approach leaves the student feeling seen, clear on where they need to grow, and equipped with steps to take, rather than just feeling criticized or confused.
The source also lays out a structured curriculum for applying conscious language throughout a student's educational journey called Trayectorias de Sentido, Trajectories of Meaning. What does that look like across the different stages?
This provides a progression for integrating conscious language based on developmental stages, ensuring it's age-appropriate. There are 4 main stages outlined. Initial stage, roughly kindergarten to 2nd grade. The objective here is simply to awaken students' awareness of the power of words.
Planting the seed.
Exactly. Activities include simple games focused on positive words, reading and creating stories with strong affirmative characters and phrases like, I am brave, we can share, singing songs with conscious lyrics like, my voice is important. The focus is on experiencing the positive feeling associated with certain words.
Okay, initial stage.
Primary stage, roughly 3rd to 5th grade. Students begin to understand how language organizes thought and affects others more explicitly. Activities involve analyzing common phrases they hear. Are they helpful or hurtful? Introducing basic emotional grammar, how tone changes meaning. Practicing active listening skills, and rewriting simple stories or everyday scenarios using more conscious language.
You're becoming more analytical.
Yes. Then, secondary stage, roughly 6th to 9th grade, language becomes a tool for deeper critical thinking, structured debating, creative expression, and acknowledging complex emotions and experiences, including healing.
More complex applications.
Right. Students analyze different discourses in media or history for bias, practice respectful argumentation on local issues, work on resignifying stigmatized words related to their community or identity, and write personal narratives using conscious language to process experiences.
And the final stage.
Media stage, roughly 10th to 11th grade. Language is used for exploring vocation, leadership, and transforming the territory. Big picture stuff. Activities include writing personal manifestos about their future and their community's future, leading projects that integrate conscious language, like creating community podcasts or digital campaigns, simulating community assemblies to practice civil discourse, and designing local glossaries of dignity or regenerative terms.
That provides a clear roadmap for building linguistic capacity over time, from basic awareness to active transformation. And this is all happening not as a separate clash, but integrated transversely across all subjects. You really mean all subjects.
Exactly. That's the core idea. The math teacher models clear, precise language when explaining equations. The science teacher models how to ask questions that open inquiry. The social studies teacher models how to analyze narratives critically and discuss sensitive topics respectfully. Every single teacher, in their own way, is participating in the student's symbolic education, modeling how to name the world with intention.
This brings up the indoctrination concern again, doesn't it? If it's everywhere, how does the methodology ensure that this transversal teaching of conscious language doesn't become about subtly pushing a specific political agenda or a single way of thinking?
It's a valid concern, and the source addresses it as a constant conscious effort required from educators. Teachers are trained not to impose a single truth, but to teach pluralism.
Pluralism, meaning?
Meaning exposing students to different, even conflicting viewpoints on complex topics and giving them the tools to analyze each one critically. They make the intentions behind language explicit. Asking who is speaking, why are they using these particular words, and what is being omitted or downplayed in this narrative.
Making the speaker's agenda visible.
Yes. They model respectful disagreement, showing students how to articulate why they hold a different perspective without resorting to insults or dismissiveness. They build a critical vocabulary by exploring the origins and historical uses of loaded terms like justice, development, or equality. And crucially, they create safe spaces in the classroom where students feel secure asking questions, expressing doubts, and sharing their own perspectives without fear of judgment or ridicule. It's about fostering intellectual courage and respect for difference.
It sounds like it requires a high level of skill and awareness from the educators themselves. They need training in this.
Absolutely. Deep training and ongoing reflection are key components mentioned.
How is progress measured in this system? How do you evaluate the transformation of language use? Not just content knowledge. You can't just give a multiple choice test on conscious language.
Right. The source proposes rubricas de lenguaje consciente, conscious language rubrics. Evaluation isn't solely based on traditional tests of subject knowledge. It incorporates criteria that measure how students are integrating conscious language into their thinking and communication.
What kind of criteria?
Things like clarity and precision in their communication, their ability to use respectful language even when disagreeing strongly, their capacity to analyze and integrate multiple viewpoints into their own arguments, and their skill in formulating questions that open up possibilities rather than closing them down.
Measuring the quality of their language use.
Exactly. These rubrics are applied at different stages of the educational trajectory. Tools like a bitácora symbolica, symbolic logbook, are also mentioned.
A symbolic logbook?
Yes, where students can actively track their own language use, noting limiting phrases they've heard or perhaps used themselves, and documenting their efforts to substitute and practice regenerative language. This makes evaluation a tool for self-awareness and continuous improvement, not just an external judgment.
So evaluation reinforces the core goals of the methodology itself. Beyond the school, the source talks about a curriculo symbolico for entire communities, expanding the idea.
Yes, this expands the curriculum concept to the whole territory. It's a curriculum for the community by the community, designed to help everyone learn how to name, connect, and imagine its collective future, actively valuing local stories and weaving conscious language into the community narrative.
How does that work?
Its principles include dignifying local dialects and ways of speaking, not seeing them as lesser, ensuring participatory design involving all community members in defining the curriculum's content and process, and explicitly connecting the community's linguistic identity to productive possibilities. It's co-created with the community through a 5-phase process: sensitization, understanding language's power; diagnosis, mapping the community's symbolic landscape; design, creating interventions; implementation, activities, workshops; and revision, collective reflection and adjustment.
The community becomes the classroom, and its history and language become the textbooks. That's quite profound. And this leads to practical applications like laboratorios semánticos and simuladores territoriales, semantic labs and territorial simulators.
Exactly. These are concrete spaces or tools where the methodology is applied and developed further. A laboratorio semántico, semantic laboratory, is a dedicated space which could be physical, like a room in a school or community center, or purely methodological, like a series of workshops where the community explores, analyzes, transforms, and prototypes language.
A design studio for words.
That's a great way to put it. People come together to dissect limiting phrases, create new vocabulary needed for their context, experiment with different ways of naming challenges or opportunities, and design communication strategies for community projects or dialogues.
And the simuladores, territorial simulators.
These are physical or digital environments designed to replicate real community dynamics or challenges. Think of them as practice spaces, like the Mandrake simulators mentioned earlier, but potentially broader. What is designed and refined in the semantic laboratory, new phrases, negotiation techniques, leadership narratives, is then tested and practiced in the simulator.
So you practice before going live.
Exactly. They might simulate a community meeting to resolve a conflict using depolarized language techniques learned in the lab, or practice articulating a collective vision for a project using regenerative terms they developed. They provide a safe, controlled space to train key skills like conflict resolution, empathetic argumentation, and symbolic leadership before applying them in high-stakes, real-world situations.
It's a feedback loop.
They are complementary. The lab is for analysis and creation. The simulator is for practice and application. It provides a complete cycle from diagnosis and design to practice and refinement.
Okay, this all sounds deeply human-centered, focused on words and relationships, but earlier we touched on technology. How does technology weave into this picture more broadly? It feels almost separate sometimes.
The source presents word and technology not as opposing forces, but as potential allies in transformation. Technology, when understood and applied from this conscious language framework, doesn't replace human capacity, wisdom, or the power of words. Instead, it enhances and amplifies them.
How so?
The precision agriculture example is key. The sensor measuring soil conditions doesn't eliminate the farmer's centuries of accumulated, often intuitive knowledge about the land. It provides complementary data points that allow the farmer to make more informed, precise decisions, leveraging both technology and traditional wisdom. The tech serves the human wisdom.
So tech is a tool to make human wisdom more powerful, more effective.
Precisely, when designed and integrated with meaning and purpose, rooted in the local context. The source highlights organizations like Makersy and N4NA Digital as embodying this integration. Makersy isn't just about bringing 3D printers or microcontrollers to rural areas. It's about decentralizing the creation of technology, teaching communities to design and build tech solutions relevant to their specific local needs and environment, using local language and knowledge as the starting point for innovation.
Building their own tech.
Yes. And N4NA focuses on digital pedagogy with a strong symbolic intention, ensuring that technology projects, like creating an app or a robot, are deeply connected to local stories, values, and the conscious language being developed. The tech project becomes a vehicle for expressing the transformed narrative.
So technology is created from the territory, for the territory, and with the language of the territory. That's a key integration point.
Exactly. The source discusses simulators, video games, and conscious songs as expanded grammars, tools that teach in different ways.
Expanded grammars. Explain that.
Simulators level the playing field by providing access to experiences or scenarios that might otherwise be unavailable due to cost or location. Video games are seen as a powerful parallel school that teaches complex skills like strategic thinking, critical reading of information, teamwork, and significantly reduces the fear of error because you can simply restart and try again, a crucial element for fostering innovation.
Learning through play and iteration.
And conscious songs, especially those co-created by the community, transform difficult or painful experiences into shared culture, embedding new narratives and emotional strength in a memorable, repeatable form. Integrating these tools closes the loop, connecting linguistic understanding, knowing, with emotional resonance, feeling, and practical application acting.
Making the learning multimodal and sticky. And Mandrake and Hyperbox mentioned earlier are examples of this integrated approach. How do they fit as semantic containers?
Yes, they are presented as prototypes for semantic containers. This is a slightly abstract concept, but think of it as creating structures, systems, or tools, physical or digital, that are designed to package, protect, and replicate models of conscious language and the knowledge rooted in the territory that is expressed through that language.
Like a vessel for the local wisdom and language.
Exactly. Mandrake might be a simulation environment focused on linguistic practice, Hyperbox, a physical kit combined with a digital interface for community projects, but their core function is to act as vessels that carry and transfer locally rooted knowledge and linguistic frameworks. It's taking the wisdom of the territory, articulated through conscious language, and making it shareable and replicable through design systems, preventing it from being lost or diluted.
Packaging local wisdom and language into tools, that makes the abstract idea a bit clearer. How does this relate to the idea of designing technology with sense?
It's fundamental. Technology should not be imported blindly as a solution. It must be designed with meaning, deeply rooted in the local identity, needs, and symbolic world. This means understanding the community's words, beliefs, fears, aspirations, and weaving them into the technology's purpose and design from the outset.
Can you just give an example?
A sensor developed for precision agriculture in a rural Colombian community shouldn't just measure soil moisture. Its design and how it's explained should connect to the farmer's traditional knowledge of climate and soil, perhaps using local terms or metaphors in its interface. A mapping drone used by students isn't just about collecting data. It allows a student to see their farm from above and describe it in a new way, perhaps saying, as the source suggests, "Looking down, my farm looks like an open hand," connecting the technology to a deeply human symbolic image.
The tech becomes a tool for amplifying, not replacing, the existing identity and narrative of the place.
That's the goal. Technology amplifies local identity and wisdom when designed with sense.
How does this integrated language and technology approach help cultivate vocation, a sense of calling or purpose, especially for young people in rural areas where options might seem limited?
This is a crucial application highlighted in the source. In areas where opportunities might feel limited or the dominant narrative is about leaving, cultivating a sense of imagination, productiva, the ability to imagine concrete, productive future paths connected to one's territory and talents is vital.
Productive imagination.
Yes, it's about shifting from a passive, "I don't know what I want to be," or "there's nothing for me here," to an active, "I can imagine myself doing X here, contributing in this specific way." This requires exposure to possibilities through role models and, crucially, the language to name and articulate these potential futures. You need the words to dream with.
What strategies are used to spark this productive imagination?
The source details several techniques. Sharing contextualized vocational stories about real rural people who've created innovative projects or businesses connected to their territory. Using drones for community mapping. Creating local agro-tourism brands. Developing community technology solutions. They use guided visualization exercises where students imagine their future selves and projects in their community. They engage in vocational cartography.
Vocational cartography, mapping careers.
Sort of. Mapping potential project sites or resources or collaborators on maps of their own VREDA, rural district, or municipality, making future possibilities geographically concrete. And they use symbolic prototyping labs where students can represent their future projects or ideas using simple materials, drawings, models, storyboards, giving tangible form to their imagined futures.
Making the dream feel more real.
Exactly. Expanding the vocabulary is also essential here. Introducing and normalizing terms like proyecto de vida con sentido, life project with meaning deeply connected to values, innovación desde el arraigo, innovation that grows from being rooted in one's place, tecnología campesina, technology designed and used by and for rural people. These aren't just academic terms. They are mental scaffolds that create space for new ways of thinking about future possibilities in a rural context.
Like giving them new conceptual building blocks.
Right. The example of the solar bakery is perfect.
Yeah.
A student who connects solar energy technology, a new concept maybe, to the idea of a community bakery using local ingredients, a traditional concept. That innovative idea is enabled by having the vocabulary and the imaginative space to put those concepts together in a new way.
These new words literally build the framework for new dreams. What about the powerful, often disheartening narrative that leaving is the only future for rural youth? That seems like a huge hurdle. How does this methodology address that directly?
This is where the concept of arraigo is narrated. The language of staying, of rootedness becomes central. The methodology actively seeks to transform the dominant narrative that success and opportunity are only found by migrating to cities or abroad.
Counter-programming the escape narrative.
Precisely. This involves consciously narrating belonging and possibility within the territory. Strategies include documenting and sharing intergenerational stories of resilience, innovation, and connection to the land within the community. Creating specific, positive language that validates choosing to stay and build a future there. The teacher is seen as a key guardián del arraigo semántico, a guardian of the language that fosters rootedness and belonging.
A guardian of the language of staying.
Yes. And technology, like creating local documentaries, community podcasts featuring stories of people building a future locally, or digital archives of local history, can be used strategically to amplify and share these narratives of staying, making them more visible and compelling.
So using language and technology to actively counter the pull of the leaving narrative. And the idea of new words, new maps connects here as well.
Yes, directly. Phrases like, eso no es para nosotros, or aquí no se puede, draw very limited internal maps in the minds of young people. They create psychological boundaries that feel insurmountable. Introducing and circulating new words and vocabularies derived from the methodology like prototipo, diseñar, co-crear, regenerar, soberanía simbólica, actively expand these mental maps. These new words provide conceptual tools to envision different possibilities and actions.
They redraw the map of what's possible.
Exactly. Creating glosarios comunitarios together, as mentioned, becomes a collaborative cartography, mapping out the community's shared symbolic territory and future possibilities using a revitalized vocabulary. Testimonials from the field cited in the source show the tangible shift when someone moves from saying, "I can't do that here," to "I'm designing a prototype for that." The language shift precedes the action.
Language literally redraws the boundaries of perceived possibility. In contexts marked by abandonment or a lack of opportunity, how does conscious language function to awaken desire? It seems like aspiration itself might be suppressed.
That's a critical point.
Yeah.
In environments where hardship has suppressed aspiration and desire, language must become an awakener. It teaches people not just to wish passively, but to desire with sense, to link their desires to concrete possibilities and collective well-being.
Desiring with sense, not just vague wishing.
Right. This is cultivated through intentional questioning and guiding words. Questions like, what would you genuinely like to change about our community? Or what could we create here that doesn't exist yet that would make life better? These are paired with vocabulary that links desire to action and collective benefit. What is your project? What is your dream for our community? How can we transform this situation together? Language provides the first territory where the desire for a different, better future is cultivated and given form.
It provides the tools to articulate and pursue those desires constructively.
Okay, this sounds incredibly powerful on a local level. How is this methodology scaled while maintaining its core principles and local relevance? Scaling something this nuanced seems challenging.
Scaling this approach is complex precisely because it's so deeply rooted in local context. The source outlines key principles for scaling responsibly. It must prioritize rooting the process locally, training local facilitators deeply in the methodology so they can adapt it authentically to their specific territory, rather than imposing a rigid external model from afar.
Train the trainer, but deeply.
Yes, and emphasize adaptation. It emphasizes building a distributed co-creation network, viewing every school or community group using the methodology as a potential lab for adapting and refining it, sharing learnings across the network. Prioritizing narrative before rules is crucial. Sharing the stories of transformation and possibility is more effective in inspiring adoption than simply distributing manuals or checklists.
Stories travel better than rules. And finally, maintaining the symbolic axis at the heart of evaluation ensures that scaling doesn't dilute the core focus on linguistic and narrative transformation in favor of easily measurable but less meaningful metrics. It's about spreading the seed and teaching others how to plant it in their own soil, nourishing it with local wisdom, not just replicating a factory model.
The phrase, communities speaking their own future, feels like the culmination of this entire approach. It sums it up beautifully.
It really does. It is presented as an act of symbolic sovereignty. It shifts the power dynamic from external agencies asking, what do you lack? What are your problems? To the community asking itself, what do we want to create here? What future will we name into being?
Taking control of the conversation about themselves.
Exactly. The methodology promotes círculos de palabra, word circles, not just as discussion groups, but as a form of local governance strategy, a structured way for the community to collectively identify the limiting linguistic patterns, articulate shared values, and choose the words that will guide their future actions. In contexts where material capital might be scarce, language is often the only abundant symbolic capital available. Activating and directing this capital is a profound act of empowerment and local democracy.
And technology here acts as an amplifier for that voice, helping them speak their future louder.
Precisely, when integrated with respect for the local voice and purpose. Community radio programs produced by students using conscious language, local podcasts interviewing elders about traditional knowledge captured using regenerative framing, digital murals sharing community narratives transformed through dignity language. These technologies serve to amplify the local voice, the regenerated narratives, and the community's self-defined future. The technology is a microphone and a stage for the local story, not a replacement for it. The Voces del Territorio podcast example, where students captured elder stories, perfectly illustrates this tech-amplifying intergenerational narrative in a conscious way.
Okay, so it amplifies the positive creation. Can conscious language be applied to resolving conflicts within communities, not just transforming external narratives or internal limitations?
Absolutely. The source discusses applying conscious language principles to community disagreements, framing it as creating conversaciones sin trincheras, conversations without trenches, moving beyond polarized standoffs.
Well, what are the practices?
It involves teaching practical skills for dialogue, even when there's deep disagreement, actively recognizing and acknowledging the other person's perspective, which doesn't mean agreeing with it, using those I think, I feel statements consistently, focusing on shared underlying needs rather than fixed positions, and establishing agreed-upon rules for respectful debate.
Ground rules for talking.
Yes. The source even mentions the potential for training AI tools on local language patterns to create simulators specifically for practicing these difficult, depolarized conversations in a culturally relevant way.
Using AI to practice nonviolent communication, essentially. Interesting. So it's a tool for building social cohesion and improving the health of local democratic processes.
Fundamentally, good governance at its heart is about building a conversation together, reaching a shared understanding, even amidst difference. Reactivating the collective power of shared, constructive words and narratives is portrayed as a deep political act that strengthens the social fabric and improves the capacity for local self-governance and collective action.
And how does all this focus on language translate into concrete action and tangible projects on the ground? Does it actually lead to stuff getting done?
The source emphasizes that conscious language is not meant to stay in the realm of abstract discussion. It is a methodology designed to lead directly to action. Projects are the bridge between the transformed language and the transformed reality. They make the new narrative visible and tangible.
What kind of projects?
These can be diverse. Community campaigns based on regenerative slogans they've created, like the Aquí también se puede, Here It's Also Possible campaign mentioned. Projects to reinterpret local symbols or landmarks with dignity. Mapping projects that name the territory's potential rather than just its problems. Or technology projects designed with specific symbolic sense like the ones from Makersy or N4NA.
What makes a project align with this methodology?
Criteria for successful projects include being rooted in a key conscious language word or value, like dignity, innovation, a rigor-rootedness, actively inviting narrative change in the community, promoting intergenerational listening and collaboration, having a clear symbolic dimension. What new reality does this project build or represent? Promoting new ways of speaking about the community and utilizing locally relevant technology where appropriate.
And evaluation includes the symbolic impact.
Yes, evaluation includes measuring not just the physical outcome, did they build the thing, but the symbolic impact. How did this project change the way people think or talk about their community or themselves? Did it embed the new language? Projects must touch the community's lived experience and symbolic world to be truly effective within this framework.
There's also a specific system for classifying language mentioned, the CSES system. Can you give us a bit more detail on that? It sounds like a core tool.
Yes, the CSES system stands for Conscious Socioeducational System, sometimes referred to in the materials as Clasificación del Sistema de Evaluación Simbólica, Symbolic Evaluation System Classification. It's essentially a taxonomy or classification system developed within this methodology to categorize language based on its impact on individuals and communities. It helps people analyze and understand the effect of words more systematically.
Okay, what are the categories?
The system classifies language into 4 main categories. 1, resignation. Language that expresses helplessness, lack of agency, or passive acceptance of negative circumstances. It blocks action and limits vision. Think, toca aguantar, aquí nadie se le adelante.
The limiting stuff.
Exactly. 2, neutral functional. Neutral functional. Language that is descriptive, informative, or transactional, but doesn't actively build or destroy potential. It's necessary for basic communication, but isn't transformative. Things like pass me the salt, the meeting is at 2 p.m. Just functional.
Okay, neutral.
3, dignidad. Dignity. Language that affirms self-worth, respect for others, and recognition of inherent value, even in difficult circumstances. It builds identity and mutual regard. Phrases like, you did your best effort. Every person here has something valuable to contribute.
Affirming value.
And 4, regenerativo. Regenerative. Language that combines purpose, possibility, and an invitation to action. It actively builds new realities and fosters growth. Phrases like, how can we work together to solve this? We can design a new way forward based on our strengths. This challenge is an opportunity for us to learn and innovate.
The most active and possibility-oriented, how is the CSCS system used?
It's used for analyzing communication patterns, like in the initial symbolic audit, designing educational materials or public campaigns to ensure they use dignity or regenerative language, evaluating the symbolic impact of projects, and even informing public policy language. Teaching this CSCS system to students and community members gives them a shared framework and vocabulary to become active analysts and designers of their own linguistic environment.
So they can spot resignation language and aim for regenerative language.
Precisely. It turns them into conscious agents of linguistic change, able to identify, say, a resignation phrase in a community meeting, and intentionally construct a regenerativo alternative right there. It makes the whole process much more concrete and teachable.
That provides a very concrete way to apply the concepts and measure the shift. Finally, how do the laboratories, simulators, and institutions connect to create this closing loop of transformation, bringing it all together?
The laboratorios, semánticos, and simuladores territoriales are the crucial spaces for diagnosis, creation, testing, and evaluation of this new linguistic architecture within the community. They also serve to highlight the gap that often exists between the language of external or often rigid institutions, government reports, development plans, bureaucratic jargon, and the dynamic, lived, symbolic language of the territory.
The language gap between policy and people.
Yes. The methodology emphasizes the need to reprogram institutional narratives themselves, making them more accessible, using local metaphors where appropriate, and actively involving local voices in their creation and dissemination. A policy, a program, or an initiative that is narrated using conscious language rooted in the community's symbolic world is understood and implemented with far greater commitment and effectiveness. It closes the loop between abstract ideas from institutions and the lived reality of the community, mediated by consciously chosen language.
So the methodology aims to transform not just individuals and communities from the ground up, but also the institutions that interact with them, making that interaction more meaningful and effective through language. That's ambitious.
It is ambitious, but the source argues it's necessary for real, sustainable change. And it all circles back to the core message, the potential of the rural child. By training children and their surrounding community ecosystem in conscious language and connecting them with appropriate technology designed with sense, you unlock their inherent potential to be designers and agents of transformation.
They become the engines of change.
They learn to see their school, their family, their community, and their territory not as fixed, limited places, but as dynamic spaces they have the power to shape. They become regenerative nodes capable of leading change from within their own context. And the source emphasizes repeatedly, this is not a theoretical utopia. It is presented as a proven, practical methodology rooted in years of observation and work in diverse rural realities.
Wow. That is a truly comprehensive framework, shifting our perspective from traditional infrastructure to the invisible, powerful architecture of language, from the philosophical underpinnings of antisynclecticismo to practical games like translators of the unsaid, technology integration, the CSCS system, and systemic change involving institutions. It offers a compelling vision for rural transformation, starting quite literally with the words we use.
It really challenges the very assumptions about where the power to change lies and places it firmly within the reach of individuals and communities activated through their most fundamental tool language. It's just the revolution might just start with changing how we talk.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the power of language in rural transformation, let's bring it back to you, our listener, and the source material we've explored. Consider this thought, drawn from the heart of the material we've been discussing. If language truly is the fundamental blueprint for reality, what kind of reality are the words you use every day, quietly, perhaps unconsciously, building for yourself and for those around you?
What narratives are you reinforcing with your everyday speech? At home, at work, in your community?
And if you became consciously aware of that process, if you chose to actively listen, understand, and then construct your language with intention, like an architect designing a building,
what could change? What new maps could you draw, word by word, for your own life and your own community, regardless of where you are?
Here's where it gets really interesting. So what does this all mean for your reality?
That's the powerful question this deep dive invites you to explore.
A lot to reflect on there. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.